Welcome back, everyone. This is week 2 of our game-based instruction course. Last class, we covered a couple new ideas, including that game-based learning is when educators use games to facilitate learning, that game-based learning is student-centered, and hopefully it'll increase engagement. And finally, the games can be used to prepare for future learning, learn new knowledge and content skills, practice and reinforce existing content skills, and finally, to develop teamwork and life skills. So if you took anything away from last week, hopefully you got that down. Okay, just that definition of game-based learning, that we're student-centered, and that we can be used in a variety of ways in the classroom. Now, this week, our focus is really on the act of learning and what that entails. We're going to look at ideas like, what is learning? How do we learn through play? And finally, how can we facilitate efficient learning? Okay, we want that efficiency. If we're going to be learning, we want to learn as best as possible. That's our job as instructors, and we're going to look today at some of the theories that tell us how to do that and some key takeaways. So before we get into how we learn, we really want to define what learning is. And there's a lot of viable answers to this question. Since this is not a pure educational theory course, we're going to skip some of the philosophy and really come in when scientists start to study the brain. And that is the field of modern psychology. Okay, so modern psychology really started taking off in the 19th century. We see Sir Francis Galton establish some stats techniques to help us kind of understand these variables, and people start applying them. Okay, they start studying the mind. As early as 1885, we see Erwin Ebbinghaus's seminar on memory. Okay, this is really fascinating. We'll look into this today a little bit, but he describes learning and memory, and he does all these experiments to test how long he retains different information. Okay, really fascinating stuff, but kind of one of the first big experiments on learning itself. As we get closer to the end of the 19th century, we see Freud starts doing what he does with his talk therapy. Psychology is becoming more common in the US. We're getting professors. People are writing textbooks. Okay, the APA is formed. And then one of our first learning theories is really going to take root kind of right at the end of the 19th century. And it's going to come from this law of effect. And that's the idea of how behaviors are learned, both by animals and humans alike, from Edward Thorndike, who is an American psychologist. And we'll talk about that soon as well. But before we get into the law of effect, before we get into these learning theories, I think it's important to understand where psychology was at the time. So I actually want to start with William James's Principles of Psychology to kind of give us a grasp of what psychology was like in 1890. So I was able to find this book, The Principles of Psychology, from 1890 by James. And here's his take on learning. He claims nerve currents run in through sense organs, and whilst provoking reflex acts in the lower centers, they arouse ideas in the hemispheres, which either permit the reflexes in question, check them, or substitute others for them. All ideas being in the last resort reminiscences. Okay, so what does this mean? How can we unpack this? Okay, well, nerve currents are coming in. Well, what does that mean? We have sense organs that are providing our inputs, okay? So the very first thing, we have our senses. We have inputs from the environment. And normally these senses would provoke a reflex, right, in our brain, in that animalistic part of our brain, that lower center, according to James. But when these reflexes come up, they arouse ideas. Okay, so we have this idea, this thought. Do we permit this action? Do we check it? Or do we substitute another action? And he calls these ideas reminiscences. Okay, so something is remaining from previous lessons. Some idea is hanging around telling you how to act in this situation, and that is learning, according to James. However, James also realizes, and he goes on to talk about, how in 1890 they have a very limited understanding of the anatomy of the brain, and that the theorists are almost working ahead of the anatomists, and they're kind of justifying theories as they go. Okay, here's a quote from James. Too much anatomy has been found to order for theoretic purposes, even by the anatomists. And the popular science notions of cells and fibers are almost wholly wide of the truth. Let us therefore relegate the subject of the intimate workings of the brain to the physiology of the future. And this is a powerful quote. I've had math teachers tell me that I'm gonna talk them out of a job before. He is quite literally talking himself out of a job. He's saying we do not know enough about the human brain to keep pushing all these new ideas. Okay? As a matter of fact, we're pushing so much theory that anatomy is reflecting that. Anatomy is discovering the brain in accordance with the theory, which is obviously backwards. He talks about how this is wide of the truth. Right? These ideas are so out there, they must be false. He was kind of on the right track with the cells and fibers. You know, we have neurons and optic nerves now, but kind of a similar system. But this isn't a neurology class, so we won't get too much into that today. But I just really love how he talks about leaving the intimate workings of the brain to the physiology of the future. I think this part is really key and really tells us a lot about our first learning theory and the context of it. They're saying they don't know enough anatomy to study the brain in detail yet. That we have to leave it for the future when we discover more. And you'll see the first kind of learning theory that takes off takes that approach. Okay, they take a black box approach to learning. And if you've done science or you've taught science, a black box approach is the idea that we don't know what is happening inside of this black box. Okay, there are incoming senses, and there are actions that come out. Something's going on in this black box, some amount of thinking or learning. But in reality, as scientists, we can't look at that yet. We don't have the physiology background. We don't know enough about the anatomy of the brain to really know what's going on in this black box. Now, James wasn't the only one that thought psychology was getting a little ahead of itself. Let's look at what Watson has to say, one of the leaders of the behaviorism movement that's soon to come. Human psychology has enmeshed itself in a series of speculative questions which, while fundamental to its present tenets, are not open to experimental treatment. In the pursuit of answers to these questions, it has become further and further divorced from contact with problems which vitally concern human interest. Okay, this I think is a powerful quote that really talks about kind of where psychology was at the turn of that century. Okay, Watson talks about the questions that are being asked and looked at and saying they're not open to experimental treatment. Okay, Watson's a psychologist. He's a scientist. But we can't experiment on these activities. We can't go through the scientific method and scientific process because our ideas are so up in the clouds. Okay, they're so ahead of the anatomy of the time. So I think this is really interesting, and this goes to show where this concept of behaviorism came from. And I don't think it started with Watson, but he definitely coined the term. In his 1913 paper, it's called Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It, and he really lays it all out. But behaviorism, in general, is is a movement that is about returning to the idea of the scientific method in psychology. And the idea is that we want to stick to things we can observe. Okay, we don't know what's going on in the brain. We cannot observe the anatomy of it. We cannot observe the firings of photons and that sort of thing yet, right? They don't know what's going on up here. It's a black box to them. But they do know there are things they can observe that happen, right? A stimulus, and that will trigger a reaction, a behavior. Okay, and if they observe how these stimuli work, they observe the behaviors that come out, or the behaviors that come out as they change, well, that is an approach to learning, and that is the behaviorist approach, where we're just concerned with observable stimuli and how that changes our observable behaviors. Now, when we talk about the types of learning that can take place in behaviorism, there's kind of two main branches that we like to talk about. The first is classical conditioning, and then in a second we'll talk about, it's kind of big brother, operant conditioning. Now, what is classical conditioning? Classical conditioning is the idea that if we present a neutral stimulus that normally gets no response, but we pair that, okay, so we train the subject and we pair a neutral stimulus that normally doesn't get a response with an unconditioned stimulus, something that does get a reaction. Okay, and as the brain starts responding to that stimulus, it will eventually combine the two, where our neutral stimulus then becomes conditioned and provides that same response. Okay, so there's a lot going on here. Okay, a stimulus is an action that kind of promotes something in the user, and then obviously a response can be some kind of behavior. Let's look at an example and see if this makes sense. One of the most famous experiments is Pavlov's dog. Okay, in 1897, Pavlov was training dogs, and he was experimenting with classical conditioning. Okay, he would play a sound on a metronome. Often this is referred to as a bell, but it was actually a metronome. But the dog would hear this sound, and it would have no response, right? The metronome means nothing to a dog. However, if we pair that sound with the smell of food, well, the smell of food typically makes dogs drool. Right? They get excited to eat, they start drooling. So we have this stimulus, and we're evoking a response. Okay? So by pairing this sound with the smell of dog food, eventually Pavlov's dog, just by hearing the sound, would start drooling, whether there was food there or not. Okay, this is Pavlov's dog experiment. This is how dogs are trained today. Maybe you've seen the little clickers. Okay, the idea, you click on your dog training tool, you give your dog a treat, he associates the click with a treat and that he's done a good job, and then eventually you don't need to use the treats every time. The click is enough to let the dog know that he's doing a good job. Okay, this is classical conditioning. We are pairing stimuli before it enters the brain, and we're trying to build that connection. Another example, maybe you've heard of if you've taken an educational theory course. If not, we're going to kind of go over a lot today, but you're not expected to know all this. We're just going to talk about it in the context of everything. But the little Albert experiment, this comes up a lot, both in the example of classical conditioning and an example of what not to do with the IRB. So this is an example of an experiment that would no longer be viable today. That is not permitted, right? This was wrong to do. But in the little Albert experiment, they took a 9-month-old baby and they would show him an animal, okay? A pet rat. And the baby would reach out to touch the rat, right? You'd give him a pat on the head. Normally, There's no reaction. Okay? But in the training, what they did was whenever the baby reached out for the rat, whenever little Albert tried to give the rat a pat on the head, they hit a steel pipe with a hammer. Okay? So they made a very loud noise. They scared this poor toddler every time he reached out for the rat. Okay? And he would have all sorts of negative reactions. He would fall over, he would cry, he would make faces. It's really quite a brutal experiment, but still an interesting read to how they set it up. But essentially, he would reach out to touch the rat, they would hit the thing with the hammer, and then they would test how he interacts with the rat after that. But it's another example of classical conditioning, where anytime that baby saw a rat, a dog, a rabbit, anything fluffy, he would then have that negative reaction. Okay, so this is definitely not ethical, but nonetheless an example of classical conditioning, where we're pairing these two ideas: fluffy animal, loud, scary noise. And they taught the child to fear this animal. Okay, this is the way we learn naturally a lot of the times. Maybe you reach out for a fire and your hand gets burned. Okay? And you learn that way. So that's classical conditioning. Okay, so now we know what classical conditioning is. This idea that we can pair stimulus to get out a linked response. How can we use it? Right? How can we use this to be better teachers, better instructors? Well, one example is setting expectations. Okay, this is a game-based instruction course. Maybe when a student begins a game, they don't know what to do. There's no reaction. So what should you do, knowing that this might come up? We'll set the expectation beforehand. When the student begins the game, you give them a tutorial that explains the rules. Okay, this happens before any processing takes place. You're pairing these together. Here's the game, here's the rules. Now, the student can play the game correctly. And eventually they will get to the point where you no longer need the rules. The student will know how to play the game. Okay, so classical conditioning can be used to just set expectations, to just explain key concepts before a lesson, right? So classical conditioning is about getting there before the student has to process things. Okay, getting there preemptively. Another strategy, interventions. Maybe you know a student is going to struggle with this problem-solving topic, right? You know when they try this problem, they're probably going to get an incorrect answer. So what do? Before that student tries the problem, let's give them assistance. Maybe you give them a calculator. Maybe you give them a problem-solving strategy to apply. But you're giving them that tool with the problem. So that way they can get to the correct answer. And once again, the goal is to gradually wean ourselves off of that additional stimulus to where we can do it without the assistance. Okay, so really simple idea here. Give them help, let them practice, take away the help, and hopefully it sticks. Well, that's just classical conditioning. All right, next we're going to take a look at operant conditioning, which is similar to classical conditioning. Okay, we're still providing a stimulus and measuring that behavior response. But now during training, once we get that initial response, we're going to provide feedback. Okay, and you can imagine as we keep running this training program, as we do multiple cycles, multiple reps, you're going to keep gaining feedback. You're going to keep learning what you did right and wrong. And eventually, after training, you'll be able to see the stimulus and act out in the desired response. Okay, so this is operant conditioning, where we're getting feedback after the fact. An example of operant conditioning is Thorndike's puzzle boxes. Okay, he had a variety of puzzle boxes that were different sizes, had different levers and mechanics to escape, essentially. And he would put cats in the box. Okay, so Thorndike would place a cat in a puzzle box, and he would record how long it takes the cat to escape. Okay, as the cat had multiple attempts and multiple escapes, the cat is naturally going to figure out what failed and what worked. Okay, the different steps involved in escaping the puzzle. And after enough training, when that cat is placed in the box, he's going to escape significantly faster. Okay, these are pretty interesting to view the data on. Obviously, there's a little bit of a noise, but it's essentially a decaying exponential where the cat gets faster and faster the more attempts it has. Another example from Thorndike is law of effect in 1927. Okay, here he does an experiment with people where they're given a strip of paper that's 10 centimeters, and then they're given another strip, okay, that they don't know the length of. And they're asked to estimate how big is that strip. Okay, I think it was between 3 and 30 centimeters. Okay, so you can imagine people aren't going to be 100% accurate at this. Okay, so they're going to have some amount of error, but we can measure that, and then we can train them. Okay, so what he did is he did two groups, one that received feedback and a group that did not. Okay, and the group that did receive the feedback was being operant conditioned. They would estimate that length, the paper strip, and then they would be told, hey, that's too low, hey, that's too high. Okay, and they would continually practice like that, and then eventually their ability improved. Okay, and this is very evident in the statistics where the intervention group that is getting that feedback scored much higher between sessions than the control group. Okay, so he had two groups, one that got feedback after taking their guess of the length of the paper strip, and they scored much better after practice sessions and experience than the group that got no feedback, as you would imagine. But that's Thorndike's law of effect, and a great example of operant conditioning. All right, to give another animal example, we can take a look at the works of B.F. Skinner and his Skinner box. Okay, he was another one of the psychologists that was pretty big in the field of behaviorism. So what Skinner did was he took a pigeon, put him in a box, and he had a little plastic plate. And the pigeon would sometimes peck the plate. So he put a sensor in the plate that could kind of record how many times it's been hit, how frequently. And then in training, what he did was put the pigeon in the box, would let it peck the plate, and then occasionally would feed that pigeon. Now, this is different than other operant conditioning examples because it wasn't continuous feedback. He didn't give the pigeon feedback every time he hit the plate. Maybe it was every 10 pecks. Maybe it was every 100 pecks. Okay, you could also vary based on time. Okay, maybe the pigeon can only be fed every 30 seconds when he pecks the plate, or every 5 minutes when he pecks the plate. Okay, so Skinner was the one that looked not only at operant conditioning, but on the frequency of these feedback schedules and how that plays into things. But obviously the pigeon liked getting fed. It did peck the plate more often. Pretty interesting study, though, when they start changing up that frequency and taking things away, how that pigeon reacts. We'll talk a little more about kind of those frequencies here in a minute. All right, so now we've seen kind of the examples from experiments. Well, how do we use operant conditioning? Especially in games, because that's why we're here, right? Game-based instruction. My first thought is operant conditioning is amazing at giving iterative feedback. What do I mean by that? When students try a problem, they're going to be successful or not successful based on whatever their initial ability is. However, if every time that student tries a problem, we provide feedback, whether that's just a good job or a, hey, try this instead, or, oh, you're close, you missed this part, right? That idea that we're giving them corrective feedback every time, well, eventually that student is going to improve their ability. Okay, so obviously the use of feedback reinforcement is huge in education. And a lot of that comes from this theory of operant conditioning. Another example, probably how operant conditioning is most used in education today, is student behavior. Okay, how often do you go to start a lesson and a student's talking, right? Or they're walking around the class, or maybe they got their headphones in or their hood on when they're not supposed to. Okay, depending on what level you work in, maybe these student behaviors are a major issue, maybe they're not. But either way, operant conditioning provides a way to deal with these behaviors. Okay, something is taking place in the classroom that's creating an undesired student behavior. It doesn't really matter what that stimulus is. What matters is the behavior. So whenever teachers see that behavior, what do? They call it out. They give feedback. Stop that. Right? Pay attention. Hey, listen up. Right? And as you correct that undesired behavior, over time, the idea is that the student will figure it out. And then they'll start acting in the desired way if that feedback is relevant to them and they take it to heart. Okay, so probably the biggest use of operant conditioning today is still in kind of pruning that behavior. Okay, next we're going to look at the types of feedback. So in the field of behaviorism and operant conditioning, they really focus on kind of two ideas. The first is the stimulus. Okay, are we adding a stimulus to the environment or are we removing a stimulus? This is a little confusing because when we add a stimulus, they call it positive, and removing a stimulus is negative. Okay, this doesn't mean it's positive or negative in the eyes of the student or in the eyes of the teacher. Positive or negative literally means we're adding or removing a stimulus. From there, there's two ideals in feedback. The idea of reinforcement is we want to encourage this behavior, or the idea of punishment. We want to discourage this behavior. So if we add a stimulus to encourage a behavior, that's positive reinforcement. If we remove a stimulus to encourage the behavior, that's negative reinforcement. Adding a stimulus to discourage the behavior, positive punishment, and removing the stimulus to discourage the behavior is negative punishment. Okay, so that's the framework that they use in operant conditioning. I want to give some examples because I think it's kind of hard to pick up just based on that. First, let's take a look at verbal feedback. If a student does a good job, you want to encourage that behavior, we would do either positive or negative reinforcement. Okay, a positive reinforcement might be great job. Right? You're telling the student they did a great job. You're adding a stimulus to the situation. You're adding your comments. And this should reinforce the behavior. Okay, how about negative reinforcement? Removing a stimulus. Okay, well, this would be, you guys did a great job, so there's no homework tonight. Right? Now we're going to remove a homework, something they don't like, to encourage them to keep working hard in class. Okay, so an example of negative reinforcement is taking away something they don't like. Okay, maybe the students are not doing a good job. Maybe they're really distracted with their classwork. So a positive punishment, okay, something we can add to discourage the behavior. Maybe you just tell the students, cut that out. Right? Let's do better. You're not working up to your potential, right? That sort of thing. That is positive punishment. The old mom guilt of we're not mad, we're just disappointed, right? That's positive punishment. We're discouraging the behavior by adding our comments. Okay, we could also remove a stimulus to discourage a behavior. Maybe you let students listen to music in class if they're doing a good job. And you tell them, you know what, take out your headphones. No more music today. You guys are not doing what you're supposed to do, so you're losing this privilege. We're taking away a privilege to discourage this behavior. Okay, that's an example of negative punishment. Next, an example from gaming. Okay, this week felt very psychology heavy, so here's a little bit of video game stuff at least. Let's look at how Mario handles operant conditioning. Okay, very early on, the game teaches the player jumping on a Goomba is good, running into a Goomba is bad. And if you don't know what a Goomba is, it's the little tiny mushroom guys that are kind of the weakest enemy in Mario. But the game teaches you how to operate with the Goomba through positive and negative reinforcement and punishment. Okay, when you jump on a Goomba, when you do something the game likes, it plays a sound. It gives you points, 100 points to your score. And it plays a satisfying animation. Okay, so games are interesting in that they can give feedback through multiple channels. Okay, we're getting a visual and an audio cue that we did a good job when we jump on a Goomba. There's a sound and an animation. And there's also points scored. So we know that this is what the game wants us to do because our score went up. Okay, how about negative reinforcement? When you jump on a Goomba, the threat is removed. Okay, he's a bad guy in the game. He can hurt you. But if you jump on him, the game will remove him for you. Okay, that's an example of that negative reinforcement. Okay, we're taking away something that they don't like to reinforce that good behavior of you jumped on the Goomba, good job. How about if we run into the Goomba? What does the game do? Well, the game, once again, plays a sound and an animation, but this time it's a bad sound. It's a sound of, I don't know how to describe it, but the animation is of a crying baby. I know in Super Mario Bros. 3, and the sound is not a great one because you associate it with losing. But you have that, once again, that visual and audio cue that you messed up. That's a positive punishment that the game is using to teach you don't run into that Goomba. Okay, there's also negative punishment. What does it take away when you run into that Goomba? Well, if you have a power-up in Mario, okay, there's different power-ups. You can get bigger, you can get the ability to throw fireballs or fly, right? And it'll take that away from you if you run into a Goomba. Okay, you lose that power. Or if you're little Mario and you don't have any power-ups to lose, you lose your life. Right? You lose that round. So you can see how video games clearly use operant conditioning very effectively because they have that audio and visual channel to add those positive reinforcements and punishments, and it's very easy for them to also remove things from the game because it's kind of a fixed world. They can set it up to both reinforce and punish behaviors. Okay, so I thought just a really good example of operant conditioning there. All right, and just to finish with this idea of operant conditioning, I did want to talk a little bit about feedback interval. I don't want to get too into the weeds, but Skinner, in his experiments, tried these different ratios of reinforcement, different patterns, and kind of recorded how they worked. And long story short, if you're going to vary when to give feedback, the best choice is variable ratio reinforcement, which means we're going to deliver it randomly. Okay, we're going to change when we're going to give you feedback and when not. Okay, we're not going to do it every 10 times. We're not going to do it once per day. We're just going to tell you good job or fix it randomly. You're not going to know when you're going to get feedback. They found this was the best schedule to lasting behavior changes. Outside of course, continuous reinforcement. Okay, continuous reinforcement means we get that feedback every time. The feedback is built in as part of the loop. Continuous reinforcement is hard to do in the classroom, especially when you're one teacher providing feedback to 30, maybe 40 students in some of these classrooms today. But in the world of game-based learning, we can build reinforcement into our game. Right? And then we truly are getting continuous reinforcement, where the student is getting that feedback every attempt in every loop. And so I think that is one of the clear advantages of game-based learning. Okay, we've talked a lot about behaviorism. What are the key ideas? What do I want you to take away from all these studies and all these models? So here's kind of the big picture. In behaviorism, learning is viewed as the successful change of observable behaviors. Okay? In behaviorism, we need things we can observe, things we can study scientifically. That's the big idea. We're only dealing with observables. Okay, they did not have the anatomy knowledge at the time to really get into the nitty-gritty of how the brain works. Okay, and then one of our first key ideas is that learning can be increased if we pair a helpful stimulus with a problem. Okay, this is what we can steal from classical conditioning. By providing students a helpful stimulus along with the problem, they should have a better chance of success. Okay, what can we do as teachers to encourage this? We can give students instructions with their assignment. Okay, this is classical conditioning, because if the student doesn't know how to do the assignment, they can read the instructions, and eventually they won't need them. We can give students tools and strategies that help them solve a problem before they get to it. Okay, here's our problem-solving technique that we're going to use today. And here's the problem I want you to try it on. Okay, you're already anticipating that student is going to run into that problem and get stuck. So we're going to give them the tools and strategies they need first. We're going to build the connection between that tool and our problem, and eventually they won't need that tool. Okay, that's classical conditioning. And finally, we can employ intervention strategies before students get stuck. Okay, similar to that last idea, those tools and strategies. The other side of conditioning, operant conditioning, tells us that learning can be increased by reinforcing desired behaviors and punishing undesired behavior. Okay, so what do we take from this? Let students know if they're doing a good job. Okay, tell them. Build it into your game to make a cool noise, to show a cool animation if you're a programmer. Or maybe there's a reward built into your board game or your card game, right? Let students know when they're doing a good job. Reinforce that good job and reward them in some way. If they're not doing a good job, let them know what to fix. Okay, correct that behavior. Give good feedback. Give continuous feedback if you can, after every rep. And I just talked about it, but giving that continuous feedback, we want to give students feedback every time if possible, or on a random schedule if not. Okay, so these are the big ideas. These are the things I want you to take away from the idea of behaviorism. And a lot of you are probably doing these in your classrooms already, even if you don't know the rationale behind it. Right? Telling someone they're doing a good job is a pretty simple concept, but at the end of the day, it's operant conditioning, and it's rooted in scientific experiments in the field of behaviorism. And finally, utilize repetitions, because students improve gradually over time, especially when they're getting feedback. Okay, so this is that iterative process that we've talked a little bit about. Every iteration, students get better if you're giving them feedback. So if you give them lots of reps, lots of feedback, students are going to get better over time. So the next field we're going to take a look at is in a lot of ways the counter to behaviorism. It's the approach, well, what's in that black box? Okay, what's going on from observable stimulus to observable behaviors? And the cognitivists think that's where learning takes place. That's what we need to focus on. Okay, so their approach is they're concerned with the mental activities that are going on. How is information received, organized, stored, and retrieved by the mind? Okay, that is the field of cognitivism. Right, and believe it or not, this idea of cognitivism predates a lot of these behaviorist ideals because there were psychologists that were studying the brain and how it worked as early as 1868, where Franciscus Donders studied response time and decision-making time in his experiments. What he did is participants would receive a small shock on either their right foot or left foot on this kind of, he called it a seesaw, it was this electric board, and they would either push a button with their right hand or left hand to show which foot received the shock. Okay, so his whole thought was he wants to try to time how long it takes for the brain to make a decision. Okay, so first he would tell people, hey, it's going to be your right hand. Push it when you feel a shock, and they would push it. And he would time how long it takes them to push the button without making the decision, just their response time. And then he had them do it again where they had to make the decision right or left. And by subtracting these times, he figured I can calculate how long it takes to make a decision. Okay. In another version of the experiment, participants pushed a button based on a red light or white light showing up. And finally, they even read or repeated different vowel sounds, okay? But his whole thought process is if I can figure out how long something takes normally, the response time, and then how long it takes them to make a split-second decision, and if I subtract these, I can figure out how long it takes the brain to make a decision. And it's pretty interesting. He timed all these events, and he found out the average decision-making time in each one, and I think his magic number was about 1/10 of a second, was how long that decision-making process takes for something that's a snap decision. Okay. In 1885, we talked about this a little bit in our opener. Hermann Ebbinghaus, a German psychologist, started studying memory and retention on himself by memorizing nonsense syllables and poems. Okay, he would put together these big lists of these 3-letter syllables that are not real, and he would try to memorize all of them. And then he would test himself, and then he would wait and test himself again, and wait and test himself again. So he found out a lot about how memory works through this process. Right? He utilized repetition for learning. Okay, he would read them over and over, that rote memorization, and he kept testing himself. And what he found is that memory loss occurs over time. Okay, you gradually lose some of what's stored in your memory. And he found this to be stronger with the nonsense syllables than things that make sense, like poems, which is very interesting for 1885. It's a very modern ideal. He also found the importance of reviewing material, where he looked at, well, what if I review this material I've already learned? How long will it take me to get back to mastery? Okay, and his works are summarized in The Curve of Forgetting, which is a really interesting idea. And he talks about the amount of information lost after the first hour, the first day, the first week. Okay, and you can see here where if we learn something one time, after an hour, we've lost almost 70% of that knowledge. Okay, within a day, we've lost over 80%. However, with review, okay, we gain that knowledge back. And as more and more reviews take place, that curve gets less drastic and that knowledge gets retained better. Okay? So in 1885, Hermann Ebbinghaus, studying the brain, studying how memory works, kind of comes up with this massive idea that review matters and is very essential if you want to retain learning. Okay, although there were some early kind of cognitivist experiments, cognitivism as a field really didn't take off until 1930s to 1950s. A lot of people think of F.C. Bartlett as one of the first people to really introduce those cognitivist ideologies. And in his experiment, what he did was he studied the process of memory and recall by giving British students a Native American story about ghosts and then asking them to retell the story. Okay, so this is a really interesting experiment that kind of covers a lot of bases here. First, he found that students shortened the story. Okay, the story was like 500 words. I believe they shortened it to around 100 on average. And he also found that students change aspects of the story to match their own cultural experiences. Well, this should make sense because students can't connect with things they haven't experienced, right? And Bartlett was showing that experimentally. For example, things like hunting seals in the story. Students recounted as fishing because British students at the time didn't hunt seals, but they do go fishing, so their brain was able to make that connection. Or canoes became boats on the retelling. Okay, so they're taking these ideas and they're matching their own cultural experiences because that's what they understand. So Bartlett determined that memories require reconstruction and aren't direct retrievals of information, right? You have to rebuild that memory from what you already know. You have to build that memory out of your knowledge base and your connections. Okay, so this is really kind of ahead of its time, I think, but a great start into the field of cognitivism because it really introduces the idea of schema, which we're going to talk about in a second. But that every person has their own kind of view on life, their own set of experiences. We call that a schema, and that is your perspective that you learn through and interpret the world through. And that idea of schema was actually eventually introduced by the psychologist Jean Piaget in 1936. Piaget studied the cognitive development of his own 3 children through meticulous note-taking. He recorded their reactions to stuff, how they solve problems, how they interact with the world. They said his wife carried a necklace with a notebook on it so she could take notes as well. Like, they took very meticulous notes. It was only a sample size of 3 children, but it's actually where a lot of our views on child development come from. And Piaget talked about 4 stages of cognitive development that children progress through. And we'll talk about those in a second. And like we talked about on the last slide, he coined the term schema and schemata to represent how the brain organizes ideas, patterns, and relationships. Right? That the idea that you're interpreting the world based on what is in your brain and the mental schema that you already have up there. Pretty interesting. As far as his 4 stages of development, okay, you'll see this in a developmental class. But to just quickly go over it, there's the sensory motor period where the child is getting used to their senses, just kind of their motor movements, as well as that idea of object permanence, which is if I take their toy away, they know the toy still exists. Okay, in the pre-operational period from 2 to 7 years, we start to develop symbolic thought and understand kind of how things are connected. In the concrete operational period from 7 to 11 years. Okay, now we're applying mental operations to concrete events. Okay, we understand that mass and water is conserved to some extent. We're ready for those ideas. And in stage 4, okay, now we're ready for abstract ideas. We're ready for logic. We're ready for systematic thinking. Okay, and these are kind of the 4 stages that we need to progress through cognitively to reach adulthood, was kind of Piaget's stance. Now, something interesting is all 4 of these correspond to Piaget with a different type of play. Okay, so students in the sensory motor period should be doing functional play. Okay, where they're rolling a car on the ground like a car. They're throwing a ball correctly. They're trying to use their toys in the way that is functional. In stage 2, they're doing constructive play. Now they're starting to build their own ideas. They're starting to build environments. They're starting to build structures with their blocks. In stage 3, we get symbolic play, where maybe you're pretending to be someone else. You're pretending to be a football player. You're pretending to be an astronaut. Okay? You're using props and toys to symbolize things that they aren't, but that sense of pretend is there. And then finally in stage 4, that's when students are ready for games with rules. Okay, so maybe not something that is strict, but definitely something that to give you an idea of what game students are ready for. You could use these stages of development, especially if you're teaching younger children. You definitely want to be aware of what games they're developmentally ready for and which games maybe they're not quite ready for. And these stages of development might help you do that. Right, as we get further along in the 20th century, these cognitivist ideas kind of keep coming, and experiments keep happening that kind of show these different processes. For example, Albert Bandura in 1961 studied how children learn through witnessing adults behave. Okay, so this is a new concept. You don't have to practice or take part in learning for it to happen. You can learn through observation. From watching someone else's behavior patterns, you can learn how to behave. Okay, and in his experiment, what he did was he had adults, both male and female, mistreat Bobo the doll, both verbally and physically, while children watched. He then agitated the children and gave them some free play where he observed how they interacted with the doll. Okay, so when I read this, it felt like a bit of a gray area. I don't know if this study would get approved today. It's definitely not as bad as the little Albert experiment, but they had children watch an adult say different comments to the doll about getting punched. They would say things like, "Pow, take that, take this," right? As they're beating up this doll, and then they would agitate the children. They would give them free play in a room with a bunch of cool toys for 2 minutes, and then they'd tell the children, "Okay, no more toys." Right? So they'd get the kids all fired up, and then they'd put them in another room that had toys as well as the Bobo doll. And they would watch how children interacted with the Bobo doll. And this was very interesting because not only did it show differences in how the children behaved with the Bobo doll, where they were recreating what the adults did, he also noticed differences amongst gender, both in the adult and the child. Okay, so female children behave differently than male children. Okay, female children were more likely to verbally abuse the doll, whereas males were much more likely to physically abuse the doll. And based on who the child observed also had an impact. So boys observing a female adult had a different reaction than boys observing a male adult, which I found very interesting. So Albert Bandura found that, one, that humans can learn through observation, which is where we got our concept of modeling today. And he also found that children responded differently based on various factors. So now there are cultural factors at play. There are societal factors at play. Okay, is the study about male versus female? Maybe, or maybe it's about how the male children viewed their role in society, or how the female children viewed their role in society. Maybe these are cultural differences. And that is Bandura's social cognitive theory. Okay, where there's a social side to how we learn. Okay, and he broke these down into 3 factors. There's cognitive factors or personal factors. Okay, how much do you know about the situation? What are your expectations? What kind of attitude you have, right? Things like that. Behavioral factors. Do you already have skills, practice, self-efficacy? And then environmental factors. Okay, so this was the interesting part of that Bubble the Clown experiment. Based on the social norms of being male or female, the kids acted in a different way as a result. Okay, based on their community, based on kind of how they were brought up, their environment changed who learned what. And that's a really interesting concept, and that is Bandura's social cognitive theory. All right, continuing on, in 1956, George Miller starts looking into the amount of information the human brain can hold. Okay, so now we're getting back to that concept of memory. He looked at other researchers and their data to recognize the number of channels that humans can recognize separately. Okay, so I thought this was really interesting. He had all sorts of graphs, but he basically looked at how many things can a human distinguish between, right? And he looked at audible tones. So if I play a noise, if we play 3 different notes on a piano, you'll probably do a pretty good job discerning between them. Okay, and then at a certain point, it becomes difficult to keep track of them all. He looked at the number of volume levels. Okay, can you tell which volume is which? How loud something is. Taste intensities. So he gave them different tasting products. Can you keep track of which taste is which? The number of points on the line. Okay, they're approximating linear distance. How far along is this point? And also the number of points in a square. Now we're looking both ways, kind of an area. So George Miller looked at other researchers and he kind of compiled all this information and he found this magical number of 7, okay, which he says down here. The magical number 7 plus or minus 2. And he found that a lot of times the human brain gets stuck at around 5 to 9 categories. Okay, 7 plus or minus 2. So right about there, the brain really starts to struggle separating one idea from another once we get to around 5 to 9 categories. And he found this example in all sorts of fields with all sorts of, I guess, different channels. So quite interesting there. Okay, we just talked about this idea that they struggle to discern around 7 categories. And the big thing is he showed there's a limiting factor in immediate memory. Okay, so this is where a lot of the ideas that we're going to talk about, short-term working memory, that sort of thing, come from. That there's only so much you can store in the right now in your brain. And this is also where we got the concept of chunking. Because George Miller says, hey, if we can hold this much in our working memory at a time, well, we should introduce content in chunks this big. Which makes sense. Okay? So to best utilize our limited memory, we should introduce content in small, digestible chunks so that we can learn better. Okay, pretty cool idea there. So from the works of George Miller and that idea that we have a limited working memory, we see some theories arise. The first one, information processing theory from Atkinson and Triffin in 1968, kind of treats our brain like a computer. As we take information in, okay, maybe we remember some sense. We store that information in our working memory, and we're constantly sending information back and forth from our long-term memory through encoding and retrieval. Okay? And when we are learning, when we're studying, when we're rehearsing, that takes place almost entirely in the working memory. So as we're practicing, we have to make sure that we're encoding these ideas into the long-term memory, or else we're going to lose them. Okay, another theory to follow from this idea of working memory and only having limited capacity is the idea of cognitive load. Okay, in 1988, Sweller came up with this idea of cognitive load theory that says the brain can only process so much at any given moment, right? The cognitive capacity, and he refers to that as cognitive load, the amount of thinking you can do. And so since there's a limit to how much processing power our brain has, we should really be aware of where these different loads are coming from. And he talks about 3 different kinds of loads when learning new information. Okay, how complex is the new information? Just wrapping your head around these new ideas. That's the intrinsic cognitive load. It comes from the information itself. The germane cognitive load, that's the connecting process, where we're taking this new idea and we're integrating it with previous knowledge. We're fitting it within our schema. And then finally, he talks about the extraneous cognitive load. And this is a distraction. This does not have to do with the working memory. Maybe this is wondering what time it is, or how long till lunch, or where am I supposed to start on this assignment? Okay? So extraneous cognitive load is kind of the distractions. So this is an interesting way to think about things, where we want to try to simplify new concepts, simplify that intrinsic load. Okay? Chunking is a great idea here. Give them bite-sized chunks of new information, so that way we can free up more power for the germane cognitive load, for the connections. We want to make those connections. We want that to be where the brain is working. And then finally, we want to minimize the extraneous cognitive load, the things that are not relevant to what we're working on. And this definitely comes up in the world of game-based learning, because if your rules are too complicated, you're going to have too much extraneous cognitive load. If a student doesn't understand how to play the game, or if a student expects one thing and is seeing something else constantly, this is going to put a lot of extraneous load on them. And instead of focusing on learning, they're going to be focusing on how to play the game and how to navigate the system of the game. And we want to minimize that as much as possible. And we'll talk about some strategies for that down the line. I think the concept of user experience design at its heart is all about reducing that extraneous cognitive load. And we're going to talk about that in this class for sure. And to finish, the last theory we're going to talk about was from Mayer in 1997. And it is the multimedia learning theory. And the basic idea behind the multimedia learning theory is that we have multiple forms of senses. If we can use those in connection with one another, we can build more connections and learn better. Okay, what do I mean by this? In a video, you can see what's going on, and maybe you can hear a narrator explaining a situation. Okay, by connecting what you see and what you hear, you can learn more than had you just watched the video or just listened. right? We're making that connection live as it's going. And that's kind of that theory of multimedia learning, where we really want to communicate in multiple modes when possible, but we also want to be aware of how we're communicating and how we can interpret these things. Okay, for example, sometimes, maybe you've noticed, I don't do this a whole lot, but some professors will put a huge paragraph on a PowerPoint slide and then start telling you something about the paragraph that is completely different than the paragraph. I find this very distracting and hard to follow when I'm reading one thing and I'm hearing another thing, right? So the words start to conflict with one another. Whereas if you give an image and you talk about that picture, the brain does a pretty good job connecting the details of the words with the picture. Okay, so these are the concepts of multimedia learning and kind of the last cognitive theory we'll talk about. But I mean, this is the branch of how the mind works. There are a ton of these things. There's new ones invented regularly. Micro-learning, for example, is a kind of a newer cognitive theory that's still being worked out. All right, to finish up here, let's look at some key ideas, some things I want you guys to take away from the concepts of cognitivism. First and foremost, learning is viewed as how information is processed in the mind in a cognitivist perspective. Okay, so whereas with behaviorism, we're looking at observable behaviors and how they're changed, in cognitivism, we're worried about what is the mind doing with that information? How is it processing it? Some takeaways from your students on receiving information. Different information and skills might be appropriate for different age groups. Okay, we learned that through the 4 stages of cognitive development. Another piece of information. Students learn through observations of behaviors around them. Okay, learning through observation is real. So make sure you're modeling the appropriate behavior, especially around young people. And it's also a very viable strategy in the classroom, modeling your thinking process, modeling different strategies. Absolutely works. Another point of advice, give students information using multiple formats when possible. Okay, formats that add to each other. If you're going to tell students about something, maybe show them a picture, okay, or a video of the situation as they're hearing your words. Maybe give them a prop. Maybe if you're talking about rocks, you bring a rock in of the type you're talking about, and they can feel it and see the density as you're telling them about it, right? That's the multimedia learning theory. They're going to make connections with those different sources of information when you do that. As far as processing information, try to simplify new concepts, reduce distractions. That way, students can focus on building connections. Right? This is the theory of cognitive load. This might be my biggest one that I'm always trying to think about. How can we be more efficient? How can I simplify? How can I cut out distractions? Cut out that extraneous stuff. And finally, on storing and recalling information, try to review content regularly to make up for attrition. Okay, this is what the curve of forgetting showed us. Students record information based on their own knowledge and experiences. Something to keep in mind. Okay. This is where a lot of the cultural bias comes in on different tests and different reading assignments, right? Because if I've never heard of a yacht, how am I going to read a story about a yacht and tell you what happened, right? You can only connect to your own knowledge and experiences, your own scheme of the world. And then finally, breaking information into pieces may help the brain record information more efficiently. The concept of chunking. Okay, give them bite-sized pieces that are perfect for that student's working memory. That's the goal with chunking. So yeah, these are the major things I'd like you to take away from cognitivism. You're probably doing a lot of these in your classrooms already. Maybe you know why you're doing them. Maybe you don't. Those are some of the theories that we're going to use in this class and talk about. Next class. Okay, we're going to continue on with the learning expectives. There are 4 to 5 major learning theories depending on who you ask. And my hope was to get through all 5 in this class, and I slowly realized there's a lot to these. So we're gonna hit on constructivism, connectivism, and humanism next week. We won't go as in depth on the last 2 because those are pretty recent. And we're going to look at the question, how do we engage learners? Okay, so we're going to talk engagement and motivation is going to be the big one next class. All right, I just wanted to take a look at our learning tasks before I turn you loose for this week. You guys have watched the video, so great job there. Hopefully you've also read the requirements for Project 1. Okay, that first question is definitely going to be applicable to what we talked about today. There's also a practice quiz game for today that covers today's content. This was something I wanted to try out in PowerPoint using macros, which allowed me to do some cool things like keep score, routing different question choices to different slides. But unfortunately, I found that it's a bit of a pain on the security side of things because macros can also do some less educational things. So in order to get this game to work, I apologize. This is my first experience with macros. What you have to do is hit download. And then when you download a PowerPoint with macros, it comes with the macros pre-blocked. So what you'll have to do is right-click, go to Properties. Next to Security, click Unblock. Okay. And now when we launch the game, we'll see this alert and we'll be able to enable the content for the session. So this is how we enable the macros. Hopefully you guys are able to run it. You might not be able to run it on a school computer or work computer. But just log in. You can hit new game to reset your score or just click to the next slide. And each slide has a question. Similar to Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? You have 2 lifelines, a 50-50 and ask the audience. The way I set it up, you can use these on any question. So feel free to use them more than once. Kind of play with them. If you can, please have the audio on during this because I'd like you to listen to the different noises. Okay, we're going to experiment with these ideas of reinforcement using the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire soundtrack. But yeah, you can get in here, try out the different questions. The first one, which learning theory focuses on observable behaviors? Okay, if you get stumped or you're just curious, you can ask the audience. 60% say behaviorism. It's a pretty good idea. If you're still stuck, you can use the 50-50. And look at that. It's probably going to be behaviorism. Okay? So try this game out. Work through all the questions if you could. Our discussion will ask you about this game this week. So please let me know if you're not able to open it. If the macros are giving you trouble, we can figure out an alternative assignment. When I went to post this last night and downloaded, I realized this macros were going to be an issue. I probably won't do these again if I'm pushing content out to students, but it's a good learning experience nonetheless. And I do think there's some cool stuff you can build in PowerPoint to use in your own class where you wouldn't have to push this content out and it wouldn't be an issue. But yeah, try that out. Check out the discussion. It asks you about a couple different parts. And I hope you guys have a wonderful week.